I will introduce you now this morning's speaker, John Hall, who is Operations Director for Skarbek Associates. Very, very happy to have John with us this morning. John studied natural sciences at Cambridge before embarking upon a career in the military, then joined the corporate world. I might get the chronology here slightly mixed up, but you know, time is a social construct, so it doesn't really matter. And then did various degrees in psychology and has been working at Skarbek Associates for the last few years as well. He's going to talk to us today about being a leadership connoisseur in the age of Trump. He's going to talk about, well, among other things, how leadership thinking has evolved over time, maybe give us some sense of different leadership models and templates, and then talk about whether or not Trump can be understood in reference to any of those templates or models. I'm sure that'll be a short element of the discussion, or not, I'm not sure. And equally try and offer some insights about how you might take notions of leadership and apply them to your own personal careers and your own organisations. John, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. Great to be here as well. Just quickly to just talk about the organisation that I work for. This is Skarbek Associates. And we are strategy implementation consultants. So there's maybe a McKinsey or a Bain comes in, BCG, and if you like, they do their cool stuff, the sexy stuff, working on the strategy with the organisations. And then we're the guys who can come in, and perhaps our sweet spot is after they've left. And actually sometimes it seems to be a little bit harder to get these strategic initiatives going than perhaps was first envisaged. And the organisations, they need some help with the execution piece and some of the heavy lifting in terms of getting it done. So perhaps not quite as sexy as the strategy creation piece, but we try and sex it up a little bit as well, and you know, slightly bold claim, special forces of management consultancy. Now this lady here is Christina Skarbek, and this is our namesake, what the business is named after. So Christina Skarbek, she was a World War II special agent, and she operated for 4 years behind the lines in occupied Europe. So she smuggled 200 Polish airmen out of occupied Poland, who then came to fight in the Battle of Britain. So the idea that we tried to capture is that a single individual with the right mindset can actually have a strategic impact and, you know, affected the course of the war. And she was actually Ian Fleming's inspiration for the Spy Who Loved Me, and she certainly did quite a lot of spying. So towards the end of the Second World War, she marched into Gestapo headquarters in occupied France. Her lover was due to be shot at dawn in the morning. She had a bounty on her head for her activities with the partisans, and she demanded the release of her lover from jail, pretending to be the niece of General Montgomery. So pure fiction, and it worked. So she sprung her lover out of jail. So this just gives you an idea of the courage and determination of this lady. So within our Skarbek team, we do have a number of former members of the Special Forces. On the left, the chap whose face you can't see for obvious reasons. So he's actually a King's alumni and was leading this SAS squadron in Iraq. On the right, I don't know if you recognise that, but that's the breaking of the Iranian embassy siege. And the SAS commander, subsequently general, who led this operation, so he's on the board of our business as well. So this is some of the thinking that has been infused into our business. Clients that we work with, so these tend to be large, global, matrixed, complex organisations. In these increasingly complex global organisations, the challenges of change, the challenges of execution, actually getting things done, become increasingly difficult. And perhaps a typical client for us would be someone from the life sciences industry, perhaps one of the big pharma companies, although we also work with oil and gas, law firms, transformation in law firms as well. Crawford introduced me as an organisational psychologist as well. So it sounds like a slightly unusual thing. What do I do? Sort of talk to corporations, perhaps Alexa or Siri on the couch. But in fact, just to explain the space a little bit more, and if you think back to the 2008 financial crash, classical economics and the explanation in terms of cause and effect, how could this happen? How could this come to pass with everything we thought we understood about how the markets operate? And there's a very good program on Radio 4, I don't know if anyone caught it last week, about the Cassandras, about the people. It had 4 speakers on it who were people who actually predicted the financial crash but weren't listened to at the time. And one of the interesting arguments they were making was, well, not really the fault of the bankers, not really the fault of the politicians. They were operating within their systems, you know, slightly simple creatures. It was really about the professional economists not really understanding the system and the risks that were building up in the system. So economics is one lens to look through to try and understand what happens in terms of cause and effect. Business and organisational psychology, so similar focus, trying to discern cause and effect in organisational life, but just looking at it through a different lens, and that's how people think, how people feel, and how people act in business. And again, that holy grail is cause and effect, although I think my time as a psychologist has just taught me to be highly suspicious of any clear claims of cause and effect. It's not easy to discern in organisational life. So this is a big figure, 50 billion. And what this represents is an estimate of the investment in leadership development in the Western-type businesses that we're familiar with, so US, Europe, etc. Pretty big sum of money there, so it's probably worth trying to be clear about what leadership actually means and what the value of that is to organisations. More than 9,000 pieces of research into leadership, yet still you can't really say from the whole field that there's a clear agreement or conception in terms of what it actually means. So this definition here of leadership, John Ortberg's definition of leadership, so 50 billion sounds like a lot of investment just to disappoint people. And if it's okay, perhaps I'm going to propose a working definition for the purpose of what we're going to explore in the next few minutes. And certainly the space in which we work, this definition here, Richard House, sort of captures more of the space that we're thinking about in terms of organisational life. So ability of an individual to influence, motivate, and enable others to contribute towards the effectiveness and success of organisations of which they're members. Now, in terms of the institutions that like to own or make a grab for the meanings of some of these terms, leadership, strategy, certainly the Army is one as well. And I wouldn't say the Army's conception of leadership is necessarily right or wrong, or right for everyone, but certainly what the Army has done is taken ideas like leadership and strategy and made it very clear what it stands for in that organisation and how they want people to think about it. And in fact, the leader in the centre of this picture in Afghanistan is our CEO's son there as well. Now, von Clausewitz, who was a Prussian general and military theorist, famous for the dictum that war is the continuation of politics by other means, so he talked about these two ever-present factors on the battlefield, about fog and friction. The fog is the fact that you don't always have perfect information, there's ambiguity, there's confusion. And then friction is all the small things that conspire to derail an overall initiative. So it could be the troops getting lost on the way to the battlefield, breakdown in communications, breakdown in equipment as well. And the fact that these things are always present, this is the environment that you're training people to deal with. This is what you're expecting leaders to deal with. And the idea that you can inoculate people against this in the way you train them is a lot of the focus of the training in leadership in the military. So this was the first leadership model that I was trained in at Sandhurst. So this is John Adair's model here, the 3 needs model, and this was the start of the inoculation I received in terms of how to deal with fog and friction. You can see just a very simple model here as well, about the balance between the needs of the task, the needs of the team, and the needs of the individual. As a leader, splitting my time and effort and focus appropriately between these different requirements. So am I focusing too much on the task, not enough to the team, or is it all about the team, not about the task? So very, very, very straightforward. I think you're aware that there's been an evolution in terms of leadership studies and leadership thinking. And certainly initial work started in the area of traits. So it was about people. It was about people being born into the position, the great man type of theories. The next set of studies moved into the area of style. So actually, what do leaders actually do? Before then moving on to contingency theories like situational leadership, where maybe people adapt the styles, what they do to the situation as well. And then more latterly, it's been into the area of the concerns of followers. So this is where transformational leadership, transactional leadership, servant leadership, the charismatic leadership, these type of styles have become the more latterly talked about or used models as well. We might wonder, does that mean that it's an ever more perfect evolution and there's some fundamental truth about leadership there that's being uncovered over time? As Crawford mentioned, my first degree was in geology. And almost in the same period of time that these leadership studies had taken place, tremendous progress in that field. People didn't actually know that half the continents of the world started around the other side and migrated across. That was only uncovered in the 60s. And there are some fields in psychology where there has been progress made, perhaps towards a version of truth, certainly in personality studies. Most studies in personality now, in terms of research and practice, have coalesced towards a particular model. But certainly my view is in the area of leadership, it's much less clear that we're any closer to something that might be a truth. Another way perhaps to think about it is, are these leadership models inextricably linked into the society of the day as well? And certainly those trait models emerged in the early 20th century when people were very much born into these leadership positions and assumed those. The work on styles was started during the war when people were starting to consider, is there a difference between autocratic and democratic societies and the way that people maybe lead and influence in those societies? and obviously post-war period, a much more egalitarian period where people could take up different opportunities. By the 60s, we're into the computational age, so a model like situational leadership, which is almost like a flow chart and some if-thens. You can see how that could have emerged at that time. And then now in the 21st century, the concerns of followers, so globalization, empowerment, values-based businesses, and you can see how perhaps the more contemporary models fit there. So perhaps it is just a reflection of the times we're in. And there's another idea, which is that the binary model, and perhaps these models are just an oscillation between science and culture. And maybe the next oscillation is from some of these models centered on followers, so quite cultural models, towards models centered actually on neuroscience and actually being able to look into what's happening in the brain as people try and exert leadership or are led. The model I want to spend a little time looking at though now is one that comes more from that the cultural side. So it's a model that there's quite a lot of excitement about, certainly in academic circles. I don't know how well known it is yet, and it's rooted in the area of social psychology. So social psychology, going back to the think, feel and act, so it's about that, but it's about how others influence the way that we think, feel and act. And there's certainly been somewhat of a crisis over the last several years in social psychology, in the sense that there's quite a lot of famous experiments. So this is a picture from Milgram's experiment. So I don't know if you've heard about this one, but this is where volunteers were coming in and led to believe that they were giving electric shocks of an increasing duration to some poor chap who was behind a screen and screaming away. Now this chap happened to be an actor and was taken almost as proof that anyone who's put in a concentration camp and given a uniform is quite happy to be a concentration camp guard, etc., what humans are capable of doing to other people. But certainly in recent years there's been a big backlash in the discipline against this type of work, and the fact that it's sort of very artificial, perhaps faintly ridiculous, people dressing up, setting up these very artificial situations. And for a profession like psychology that's meant to do no harm, the idea of tricking people, humiliating them, is probably not the right direction to go. And I think the other issue, in fact, some of these, quite a number of these classic social psychology findings have not been proven to stand the test of the time. They're not replicable as well. There is one area of research that has stood the test of time coming out of the social psychology space, and this is social identity leadership. And Hogg, Haslam, Plateau Hounds, perhaps some of the key names that you come across when you look at the literature in this area. And certainly this is part of the continued move away from the great man theories of leadership. In fact, going back to how Adair and the Sandhurst model talked about leadership, more about the we-ness of leadership than the I-ness of leadership. So looking at leadership as a property of a group, rather than just always concentrating on the individual, as a lot of the earlier theories have done. And where this really starts is in terms of how we think about ourselves, how we categorize ourselves, about our identities. So if you imagine we've got Amy and Beth, two individual people with their personal identities, but once we start to move into the group context here, Amy and Beth start to see themselves as a group in terms of the shared identity. So it starts to become about an us, a we, and to some extent about a them as well, because there's some men there as well. And what this taps into is the fundamental human desire or need to be part of groups. So you guys are all here today as KCL alumni, and this is a context, a social identity. So it's set off by the branding, it's set off by being back in a familiar place and with people that you perhaps recognise. And the idea of the theory in terms of social identity is that you measure your status by the group that you're part of, and this is what is driving our fundamental need as humans to be part of these groups. And once we're in these groups, we start to behave differently. Our personal identities tend to go to the background, and the group identities come to go to the foreground. So we'll tend to communicate better with people in the group. We'll tend to like people more in the group because we're not seeing them so much as individuals. We're more seeing them as this group prototype that's very similar to ourselves as well. So when you're networking here, you're likely to share information perhaps that you would normally hoard. You're likely to make introductions. You're doing things that are perhaps not necessarily in line with your immediate personal values, but you're moving much more in terms of your behaviour, your thinking and outlook to the values of the group. Now you might start talking about what UCL are up to and the report in the papers that now they've overtaken Oxbridge in terms of the highest paid graduates. And this is part of the in-group, out-group comparison that's going to start to drive how you view your status in that group and social identity. So it's not just about your in-group, it's also about being able to make the favourable comparisons to other groups as well. For instance, like the UCL guys down the road. Now, then you might be at a business lunch or something later today, and you're sat next to a UCL alumni. But you two might form a shared social identity and bond around the fact that you come under the umbrella of the University of London, and in fact you're comparing your status favourably to those with different educational university backgrounds as well. So this is a sort of nested concept of social identities that we categorise ourselves in through this fundamental human need to be a member of groups. Now, I don't know if you're chatting after this and you find that someone else is a lawyer as well, and that could be the start of a new in-group as well, and you might start comparing yourself favourably to the other professions that are here. So it's nested upwards and it's nested in a downward direction as well. So in summary, what we're talking about in these situations is not the top route in terms of building or satisfied self-esteem, so it's not about personal identity, personal achievements, it's the bottom route, and it's about our social identities, the identities that we hold in groups and the group influences in us that actually allows us to satisfy our self-esteem there as well. This is the same thing here, just a little more detail, how we shift from that personal identity into the group identity through this mechanism of categorizing ourselves and how these categories can change depending on the context. And it's the intergroup comparison that drives this satisfaction of our social identity. So there's some very interesting bodies of research in terms of what this drives in organizations. One particular area is in terms of mergers. So if you see a full service airline merging with a budget airline, and then immediately you've got a stratification in terms of the in-groups and the out-groups and the social comparisons that occur there. And typically what you see in the case studies is in the group that's perceived to be more junior, that in fact you'll see a high rate of turnover in the 2 or 3 years after the merger. And a lot of the value that was assumed going into that merger suddenly gets leaked, and it often leaks out through the more junior status organisations. So same thing in terms of NHS trusts merging, and it only takes some small differences to affect the perception of who is the junior partner in that to start to get some of these sort of slightly more destructive processes running. But the phenomena that I want to focus on that comes out of these group studies is leadership. And with this social categorisation going on, what does it take? Who is the most influential person in terms of directing these groups, influencing these groups? And that brings us to the Donald. So relatively easy to throw in some Trump for good measure to get interest. But I think what's interesting about Trump and the way politicians normally operate with pretty narrow bands of cause and effect hypotheses in their focus groups is Trump has thrown this wide open. He didn't even think he'd win the presidency. He's gone extreme in terms of the boundaries of behaviour and the things that he's tried. So it's almost like a glorious experiment that we're living through, getting to see some things that we don't normally do. And in fact, some of the things he does really demonstrates actually perhaps some of the mechanisms that work in terms of social identity leadership and how people can become very influential over groups in these in these type of group situations as well. So there are 4 key elements in terms of social identity leadership. And I think the first one illustrated here. So leaders need to be in-group prototypes. So one of us to be influential in setting a direction. And part of this is being the right man for the times. So Rudy Giuliani or Donald Rumsfeld, who were the right people at the right time for the post 9/11 response, whose then careers subsequently waned afterwards as the public mood shifted. Or someone like Churchill as well, who was ostracised many times during his career, but there was a time when he was the right person for what was required in terms of the identity, the feelings of people, and the things that they wanted to drive forward in terms of their values. The second key element here is leaders to be in-group champions. So this idea of doing it for us and advancing the collective interest. Some of this, I'm sure you're aware, it might be rationally destructive potentially, but what it is doing is rewarding and enhancing the identity of the group. I think the third area is that leaders need to be entrepreneurs of identity and constructing an identity for their group. So this is not necessarily about conviction in leadership, slightly more chameleon-like than that. And I'm sure you're aware that Trump, by the latest count, maybe 5 potential considerations or aborted attempts to run for the presidency, potentially as a Democrat. Certainly he's been very close to the Clintons as well. So in fact, this long period of time where he's clearly been thinking about the identity that he's going to adopt when his time comes, maybe trying different things. I mean, there's the idea that the Apprentice shows were an opportunity for him to kind of try on these different identities as well. Other leaders in history are referenced in this area. For instance, Mandela. I don't know if anyone's visited Mandela's cell on Robben Island, or the quarry where him and his fellow prisoners were chipping away at the rocks, going blind because the rocks were so white, so bright. But that was almost 20 years spent with him and his colleagues actually constructing this identity, this idea for post-apartheid politics. How are we going to create this identity, craft this identity? And then the fourth area is leaders needing to be embedders of identity as well. So Trump, he's won the election, but he's constantly back to his rallies, on the campaign trail. He's going back to the rituals, he's going back to the processes that create this situation, that create this context where the social identity that he's developing becomes salient as well. And again, other examples in the research, I mean, they go back as far as St. Paul and the early Christian church. So he introduced the Eucharist, communion, into the Christian church, and this idea that the rituals embed these social identities, or just as you guys come here today for an alumni session as well, this is embedding the social identity of the KCL context. And just a little contrast to thinking back to Obama, his professorial air, his sort of slight aloofness and goodness, which I'd argue is almost the epitome of a transformational style of leadership. So it's about idealized influence. It's about inspiring your followers to go and do greater things. The yes we can, and stark contrast to build a wall or lock her up. However, the opposite of the transformational style, this Obama style, is the transactional style, typically seen as the domain of politicians. That if I vote for you, I get some direct benefit, I get a subsidy, I get some pork barrel politics, something like this. But again, I think with Trump, something slightly different is going on as well. Does he really need to build this wall? Is that what people are looking for? And certainly there's a time where everyone became very obsessed with the feasibility of the wall. How long's the border? How much is it going to cost? I was a military engineer, so building walls, building fortifications, interesting to me as well. But I think we're missing the point. Whether or not the wall gets built at all, it actually just comes down to this thing of identity and what he's seen to stood for and the values that Trump is pushing within his base. And that does beg the question, so where does it end? How does it play out? Where will things go with tariffs? Are these people going to get some financial rewards? And maybe it's unlikely, and probably the next bit of the experiment is how the midterms go. Will Trump get a second term? Although one of the elements of the social identity model of leadership is these leaders, they do tend to get a certain degree of allowance from the group for failure, a certain tolerance for failure as well, because it's a shared identity and people are seeing themselves as very similar. The incentive is there to actually overlook some of the failings on the part of the leader as well. So we'll see how this plays out. So Senator John McCain, famous war hero who died a couple of weeks ago, and certainly there's the idea being put about that perhaps some of the Trump era started with his pick of Palin and starting to tap into this type of politics. But I wonder sometimes if political memories are a little short, and if you remember Bush and Bushisms, and I think people have pretty much got the idea that once they got over how stupid Bush appeared to be, in fact the more that people actually built denigrated his character and built up this idea of the guy who was frankly a slight idiot, in fact the more this seemed to energise his base and in fact support the values of the group that were behind Bush as well. So probably this has been going for quite some time. So just bringing it back to the business context, and this, in terms of the social identity model, is the very simple summary, the 3 R's of social identity leadership. So reflecting, which is to observe and listen to the group in order to understand its culture. Representing, ensure your actions reflect and advance the group's values. And realising, which is about delivering and be seen to deliver things that matter for the group. There's even a link back to the Adair model, much older model I was taught at Sandhurst. So he was an Arabist, and certainly one of the ideas that he talked about was the leader as a cultural transmitter of values as well, so similar to some elements of this model. So in the work that we do with organisations, one of the key challenges we see at the moment, particularly for senior leaders, it's not necessarily about leading their own functions, their own verticals. It's actually about how they influence across and outside of those silos. And the dysfunction starts when they really start to struggle to influence across areas of the business, and that makes it particularly painful for their people who are actually working further down in the silos, when those people actually need to work with people in the other silos in order to deliver the key things the business need. And a lot of that 50 billion investment in leadership tends to go to the people whose names are in the boxes at the top as well. Investment in leadership, it flows into senior leaders, it flows into line managers, but a lot of the key initiatives certainly that we work on and with organisations on, so innovation delivery, transformational change, critical projects and programmes, these require people from all across the different functions and silos in the organisations to link together in terms of delivery. And you tend to get a lot of temporary teams of purpose, particularly for just that one project or that one innovation, that one key initiative. So in fact, the ability to lead and influence outside of that traditional hierarchical structure, certainly as we see it, is becoming ever more important now in terms of delivering some of these critical things. What tends to go on in the vertical silos is the business as usual, the finance functions, the marketing functions, doing what they all did, but it's not until you connect those functions across the business that some of these key strategic initiatives can be delivered that allow the businesses to compete and grow. What we find here is almost something of a middle management crisis as well, where the senior leaders will make a grab for the strategy part of things, and then the assumption is that somehow people are going to find a way to do the job. And we're seeing increasingly the parts of organisations that link together the silos, so these could be program management offices, project management skills, program managers, are being hollowed out, and the assumption is somehow the job will get done. In fact, the reality from our perspective, there's increasingly complex businesses, increasingly complex world, and people are well prepared, they're well trained in their functional and technical responsibilities, but they're not prepared in terms of how they work together in an integrated fashion, how they lead ad hoc teams across the boundaries of the business. Just some of the work that we do, and a lot of the work we do is on the job. So we spend a lot of time preparing people to lead key initiatives in business, often leading from a position of, without direct authority as well. And sometimes we can take people out of their business environment, kind of create something a little bit different. So this is an exercise we run, and it's about a hurricane hitting Guatemala. Really, we take people into a scenario that's safe, because they get to explore things that may be much more difficult to explore in terms of the real hot button issues at work. But we take them into this scenario. In this example, we split the teams. There's the United Nations, there's the government of Guatemala, there's the US military, and we have competing teams and people on those competing teams with different information, different objectives, different agendas, and we work through creative problem solving, we work through ad hoc leadership, leading temporary teams, we work through communication, and how they work together to execute these non-business as usual problems that are increasingly taxing for corporations. So, there are a number of leadership models and paradigms that can be used to suit the situation or the problems that an organisation or part of an organisation has got. There are some times when this might be the right one as well. There are some times that aren't pleasant in organisations, and maybe this is what people need to be focused on in terms of their leadership. And it's unfortunate, but it can work. And we use different leadership models according to different situations. Servant leadership, situational leadership work quite well for some of the things that we're doing as well. The message I was wanting to give was shop around and be educated. Beware of received wisdom in this space as well. It's worth taking the risk to start to try and get what fits your needs for the challenges, and to consider the change implications of it as well. So if we're taking a leadership model or a leadership idea, can our people understand it? And I talked about two models, very simple, the 3 needs model from Sandhurst. So I was in Singapore last week working with a fast-growing pharma company there. We're looking at their execution of innovation. A lot of the people I was working with, they'd had no leadership training because they were not line managers. But then these simple models, the 3 R's model or the 3 needs model, help get people working more effectively in that space from a limited base as well. So that question, can our people understand it? I think in change, some stats, 44% of failure in change is because people simply don't understand what they're being asked to do. So there's a definite value in simplicity. Metaphors are very useful as well in terms of conveying the idea, how you want people to think, how you want people to think about leadership. And you can select metaphors from different domains, from sport, from war, from family, community, to drive those models of thinking. And stories are important as well, because stories are how cultures are transmitted. Probably less stories about Trump at work, but stories, case studies about things that have happened in the business that drive the direction of thinking as well. So done well, getting the leadership approach for your organisation or for your team right. What you can do by getting it right is you sort of legitimise the change that you're looking for, and how people define the problems they see, how they find solutions, their frameworks for thinking, how they interpret events, and reducing anxiety as well in terms of the things that people face, the challenges in their organisational lives. Again, another challenge, sometimes in large businesses, sometimes there's even only one leadership model available. It's been kindly selected by HR, procurement have kindly tendered for it to get it at the best possible price, and that's the paradigm that you're locked into. There's quite a useful study by McKinsey 2014, again looking at this 50 billion spend and highlighting what are the 4 main reasons for failure of leadership development. So the first one is overlooking context. So this is the idea that one size fits all for organisations, and I think also being conscious that going back to those, the evolution of leadership models, all of these have evolved in Western culture as well, and increasingly globalised businesses. We have to be sensitive to the context of the leadership models, and very little research has come out of China, but when you read it, it's fascinating, completely different. So the idea of the uncharismatic, long-term, slow decision-making leader, for instance, in Chinese business culture, and you realise there's a completely different paradigm out there as well. Second cause of failure, so decoupling the leadership development from real work. So people go away on a leadership retreat, come back to work, and it feels like they've sort of woken up from a dream, and they carry on as before. The third area is underestimating mindsets. So yes, you can be pushing a leadership model into a team or into an organisation, but if you've not really understood the mindset of why people are behaving or leading in the way they are at the moment, then this can be a big barrier to return on investment. And then the final point there, not measuring results as well. So actually not checking if what you're doing is working and almost measuring it as investment. We're investing X in our leadership development, but not really looking for where you're expecting to see the results in the organisation. And as I said, cause and effect, not necessarily easy to discern, but I think this biggest failure in the whole space of training is the not measuring results from the investment as well. I hope this has sort of prompted some useful thoughts as well. In case you're interested, a couple of books here that I'd recommend. So on the left, Keith Grint, Leadership, a very short introduction. So you're interested in exploring that space in a pithy way in terms of leadership ideas and evolution. And then the book on the right, if you're interested specifically in that social identity model of leadership, what it can do to help people lead outside of traditional boundaries or to have influence over fast gel teams, get traction quickly. And that's an excellent book, and that also covers quite a lot in terms of leadership history that leads up to this point as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the extent to which you think Donald Trump is a sort of socially skillful leader for getting into the position that he's in, or is he really just a product of the zeitgeist, or both?
In the social identity theory and leadership, this definitely is a sort of question or open question, is if you like the degree in which the environment creates the leader, and the degree in which the leader can influence that environment as well. I think, like most of these questions, it sort of tends to come out as a balance between the two potentially. So not more, potentially not more of one than the other. I think maybe the observation on Trump is that he's had an extended period of time in public life. If you like to experiment, almost like trying to find a resonant frequency and figure out what it is that people respond to. And then once he's found that, he's just carried on nailing it, and there's no doubt that's affected the identity that he's going from a Democrat-leaning type of figure to someone who's found that resonance with the base and completely exploited it. Yeah.
Well, John, thank you very much. It was a fascinating talk.